The Edmonton Oilers are less than a month away from the NHL trade deadline, and on today's edition of Locked On Oilers Trade Board 4.0.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on today's episode, a very special trade deadline board 4.0. Today's episode, very straightforward. Forwards, defense, goaltending, one for each segment. So, before we talk about who the Oilers could get, we could talk... Before we talk about who the Oilers could get, we should probably talk about what the Oilers need. And some of this is going to be by necessity, and some of this conversation is going to be on availability, because we know the Oilers have a crowded forward group, and we know the Oilers have the lingering return of Evander Kane hanging over the team as well. And I mention Evander Kane because as a player with 20 goal seasons, proven track record of success at the NHL level, and he is going to be the fifth left winger on the depth chart. Of course, Evander Kane, with the salary he makes, the respect he has earned as a player throughout the league, he is not going to be the fifth left wing on the organizational depth chart. As we sit here right now, we know going down the left side in some configuration, and we know right now going down the left side, there's Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Vasily Podkolzin, Matthias Janmark, and Vasily Podkolzin. Those four guys are all playing left wing at the moment. We know the Oilers have the flexibility with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins where he can play center if needed on occasion. We know Nugent-Hopkins is valued as a penalty killer as well. And we also have to consider that Vasily Podkolzin has been stapled to Leon Draisaitl for the majority of the season. Draisaitl's most common line mate so far this season, and that could change. The Oilers could opt to do something a little bit different after the Four Nations face-off break, but I understand that some people watching or listening might be saying, well, Nick, can the Oilers really bank on Evander Kane playing his first hockey in 9-10 months and being effective? No, he can't. That's really the conundrum the Oilers face here, and it's very similar to what they're doing with John Klingberg. But John Klingberg, who we'll talk about in the second segment because that he is part of the defense conversation as well, he's working it out in real time in the regular season. You know, he's getting the month of February to figure out his game, and it is de facto serving as an evaluation period for the Oilers to look at his game and say, do we think he is improving? Do we think he is getting more comfortable? And most importantly, do we think this guy can play on our second pair come playoff time? Because that's what that conversation's about. But Evander Kane, he's not going to be afforded that same ramp up process because his cap hit and his recovery aren't going to coincide with being conducive to returning to play in the regular season. And I'm sure there's a mathematical way the Oilers could find a way to get Evander Kane on the roster in the regular season by trading away a player or two or waiving some of the excess players like Kasperi Kapanen, who have done a nice job. And we'll talk about the right wing and the center position in a minute. But down the left side, they already have their pod committed to four left wings. They have four left wings on the roster, and then they have Evander Kane as a fifth. So I hesitate to think the Oilers would be looking at a big picture left wing, you know, somebody particularly impactful. Down the middle, McDavid, Draisaitl, Adam Henrique. Derek Ryan got waived. Noah Phillip has played, but hasn't gotten a ton of burn, is yet to record a goal, but he's not on the team to score goals. I would be very surprised if the Oilers went into the NHL playoffs with a rookie center. I just don't think that's something you would see a team that has cup aspirations do. Somebody who just doesn't have a ton of NHL experience in that type of role, which is very specialized and very defined. You know, you're expected to be a good face-off guy. You're expected to kill penalties. And as a young guy, you're never going to be as good at face-offs. Face-offs is one of those traits That gets better with time. The longer you're in the NHL, the more tricks, the more bells and whistles you learn about leverage, about angling, and how to win them more effectively. So with time, I expect Noah Phillip to get better at faceoffs, but I don't think he's someone you could realistically expect. And I just don't think that's something that cup teams do. And I hate evaluating everything through the lens of, well, this is what the last 5-10 Stanley Cup winners have done. But at the same time, there's a reason that something like that most teams that win the cup, they have one rookie at the most in their lineup, and it's not going to be in a role like that. Typically, you would expect it to be a high-end rookie, somebody who has good counting stats and some dynamic traits to kind of offset their relative lack of inexperience. Then, down the right side, you have Zach Hyman, you have Corey Perry, you have Kasperi Kapanen, and I suppose you have Connor Brown as well. So we know Connor Brown is staying in because of his penalty killing, and that's why him, Henrique, and Janmark have stayed together so much, because Chris Knobloch likes the way they kill penalties together. We know Zach Hyman is going to be in the top 6. As for Kasperi Kapanen and as for Corey Perry, I think their positions in the lineup are a little less certain. I think in an ideal world, you probably want Corey Perry and Kasperi Kapanen playing, but they both are probably playing a fourth line right wing role, which is going to preclude both of them from being in the lineup. I think that could be a spot where if the Oilers choose to keep Kapanen the rest of the way, which they very well could, you would see him in a specialist role where, depending on the game, the environment, who they were playing, you could see one or the other. And I'm not opposed to that. I think there are situations where that can be helpful to have that degree of specialization where, depending on the game environment, you want one or the other. But as far as the forwards that are available, I think if you want to replace if you want a top 6 right wing and you want to push Kapanen or Perry into the press box, I think the most obvious choice is Riley Smith of the New York Rangers, who won't be expensive. He's an expiring contract. He's won a Stanley Cup before. He's played up and down the lineup for the Rangers this year. I think he has enough offensive upside that he can play with McDavid or with Draisaitl, and it wouldn't really be an issue either way. I think he's defensively responsible enough that you wouldn't be that weary about playing him in the top 6. I think that pushes one of Kapanen or Perry out, which by extension makes the fourth line better. It gives you a better 13th forward. Now, if you want to go for something a little more specialized, you could do something like Nick Bjugstad, who would fit as a Noah Phillip replacement. Defense first, big, hits, block shots, good forechecker. He's not great on faceoffs, though, so that might preclude him from being the target there as the Noah Phillip replacement. Other wings in consideration, Trent Frederick of the Boston Bruins, former first-round pick. He's got size, he's got energy, he fights, he likes to forecheck. Had a career year last year, hasn't really responded as well this year. The Bruins, of course, at large are struggling this year, so he might be a change of scenery candidate. The problem, I would expect the Bruins to be asking for something kind of pricey in return because he's a former first-round pick and somebody they feel just needs a change of scenery and isn't necessarily a bad player. I'd also mention Jimmy Vesey, who has spent a lot of this season on shaky ground in New York, where they've prioritized other players like Matt Rempe to stay in the lineup over him. Defense first, playoff experience, effective forechecker, a little bit of an offensive touch, can occasionally contribute a goal. I think Jimmy Vesey and Riley Smith are probably kind of the range of outcomes here, where you're either talking about somebody on an expiring contract who has a little bit of offense to his game, or you're talking about someone who's extremely cheap, who's a defense first guy. I suppose I should mention Jared McCann, who the Seattle Kraken might be willing to move. The question, of course, is would they trade him in division? And being that he has term left, could the Oilers find ways to make the money work going into future years, which would be a question. But there are candidates out there the Oilers could acquire to improve this forward group's depth. I think fourth line center is probably the most straightforward. They just don't want to have a rookie fourth line center going into the playoffs. And then, of course, can we push one of Perry or Kapanen out of our lineup and have a good 13th forward to feel confident in? We're going to take our first break of today's show. When we come back, we'll unpack the Oilers defense, what they might need there, coming up next. The World Series, the Super Bowl, the Olympics. The world's top athletes get to play in these top level sporting events thanks to one thing: teamwork. And teamwork can also protect your financial legacy and your family's future. SelectQuote's licensed insurance agents are the perfect teammates when shopping for customized, affordable life insurance. They can find you the right policy to keep your financial legacy safely in your family's end zone. SelectQuote is one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, helping over 2 million customers find over $700 billion in coverage since 1985. Other life insurance brokers offer impersonal, one-size-fits-all policies that may cost you more and cover you less, while SelectQuote's licensed insurance agents work for you to tailor a life insurance policy for your individual needs in as little as 15 minutes. If you're in good health, they work with carriers that can get you same-day coverage for up to $5 million. No medical exam required. Head to selectquote.com and your licensed insurance agent will call you right away with the right policy for your life and your budget. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. Go to selectquote.com/lockedonnhl to get started. One more time, that's selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. SelectQuote. They shop, you save. Thank you to everyone hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are doing trade deadline board 4.0. And look, the defensive group here came into the season with question marks. It's why they brought in Travis Dermott on a PTO, and he played well enough in the preseason that they felt the need to keep him. It's why they signed Josh Brown in free agency, even though I was very opposed to that signing. They knew they needed one more guy. And Matthias Ekholm and Evan Bouchard have done their jobs. That is one of the best defensive pairs in all of hockey. They are well worth the money they are paid. Evan Bouchard is extremely underpaid because he is still in the early phases of his career where he is a restricted free agent and can't negotiate to the full capacity of his earning power. Darnell Nurse is having a really solid season. He has recovered very nicely from a rough first month where the Oilers' penalty kill was atrocious, where he himself really struggled on the penalty kill, which trickled over to 5-on-5. It helps that they have found a steady partner for him in Brett Kulak. Brett Kulak is playing the most minutes he's ever averaged in a season this year, close to 20 minutes per game, where he has played a lot on his right with Darnell Nurse. I think Kulak, really, really dependable. I think he is the ideal 4-5 swingman, where in a pinch he can be on your 4, but if he's on your third pair, you probably have a pretty good defensive group. And as far as the Cody Ceci and the Philip Broberg replacements, I think it is early on Ty Emberson to make a definitive declaration one way or the other. I think at the very least he has shown you he is an NHL caliber player. The question of what his ceiling is, how much can they depend on him, that's a different question that frankly we probably won't know for another season or two, but he has shown enough that I think he isn't a liability. I wouldn't be worried if he were in the lineup. Again, if you go and look at recent Stanley Cup winners, defensemen in particular, unless they are, of the Bowen Byram, Kale McCarr, top of the draft ilk, those are guys who have a lot of experience. Everyone on that Florida Panthers team last year was at least 26, 27 years old. I think their youngest defenseman on that team was Gus Forsling. It might have been Nico Mikkola, but I'm not entirely positive. They're both the same age range of 26, 27, but you want experience on that back end. The more guys you have who have played in playoff games, that helps immensely. You build off of that a little bit more. You had to swap out Cody Ceci because you couldn't afford to keep him because you had to cut costs based on decisions you had made earlier in the offseason. And Emberson is fine. He blocks shots. He's got good size. He's not afraid to use it. He's fought a few times. I like the thought process there of identifying a player on a bad team who didn't get a ton of opportunity and saying, if we give him a specialized role, we give him someone who's more experienced to lean on, we bring him along slowly, we get a cost-effective replacement for Cody Ceci, who's a little bit less volatile, who's a little more certain. Sure, his ceiling might not be as high as what Ceci can bring you because of his offensive touch. You'll miss that clutch goal in a Game 7 should the Oilers get there without Cody Ceci, but Emberson has been more than fine, which of course brings us to John Klingberg. On opening night, I told you the Oilers needed another defenseman. More likely than not, they needed to go out and get a top 4 defenseman. The early candidates were guys like Ivan Provorov, who were on a team coming into the season, the Blue Jackets, with no expectations, pending unrestricted free agent, somebody who probably wants a chance to win before they retire from hockey. And the Oilers stumbled themselves into a good old-fashioned reclamation project. And I don't think you ever want to critique your team for being experimental when they are in a position to operate from strength. The Oilers, by virtue of the season they've had to this point, have leeway in their lineup and in their results to play guys who they are uncertain in, like Noah Phillip and like John Klingberg. John Klingberg is coming back from major corrective surgery, double hip resurfacing. It is an uncommon injury for professional hockey players. It is not something we have a terribly large track record of. You know, Nick Backstrom, Patrick Kane, Jesse Puljujarvi. That's really the extent of the list in the modern conversation. And Backstrom is probably never playing hockey again. Puljujarvi got waived, and Patrick Kane is having an okay second season after coming back from said injury. I think Klingberg through 5 games has looked a little uncomfortable. I think the game has looked a little fast for him at times. I think in particular in his own end, he's definitely been a bit wonky. I think about that one sequence in the game last week where he kind of just tripped over the ice, where he was definitely feeling the pressure of the forecheck and he just wasn't entirely confident in his feet under him. And that's to be expected. Hasn't played hockey since fall of 2023, where he played, I think, 10-ish games for the Maple Leafs before saying the pain was too discomforting. And it's important to note, Klingberg says he's in no physical discomfort. He feels good. So if that's the case, the Oilers have every prerogative to let him try and figure it out over the next 4 weeks or so. You know, the deadline is March 7th. We are in the middle of February. The Oilers have 2.5, 3 weeks of games to evaluate what they get out of him and ultimately what that means for their lineup. Because if they feel good about John Klingberg, I think your shopping list gets a lot simpler. I think you are looking at just one more guy who has NHL experience. You want a 7th defenseman who can push Troy Stecher even further down the depth chart, because we know NHL teams endure injuries. You are going to need probably 14 or 15 forwards, and you are probably going to need 8 or 9 defensemen to win a Stanley Cup. That is just simply the nature of how playoff hockey works. The accumulation of fatigue, the lack of recovery time, the proneness to injury, those conditions create. You know, you think about being overtired, being dehydrated, how easy it is to pull a hammy when you're out running, you know, you're 3 miles before work, like me. Now think about doing that in a professional setting where the other team wants to break your spirit and wants to actively hurt you and make you less effective. So you're going to need guys. As far as targets, the defensive opportunities are not nearly as enticing as the forward groups where you can kind of pick and choose, but somebody like Alec Martinez, I think makes sense. I know he's a bit expensive for what he is at like 4.5, but he's on the Blackhawks, getting overpaid to be on an actively bad team. If the Blackhawks were willing to retain some salary, I think Alec Martinez as a 7th defenseman, or as the Brett Kulak insurance, if you want to play Kulak on the second pair and you play Martinez on the third pair with Emberson, I think you'd be a little more comfortable with that. And then having Stecher as the 7th defenseman, the first guy out, I think that would inspire a little bit more. That's if John Klingberg isn't effective. I think there's a world where you could even convince me Alec Martinez sits if the Oilers were to acquire him. If you want someone right-handed, you have the options of someone like David Savard or Henry Jokiharju. I think Jokiharju would have been the move if they didn't go out and get Klingberg, but being that they signed Klingberg and his money is a little bit probably more than I would have liked, you're probably not going out there and getting a top 4D unless you feel that Klingberg can't play. You know, if we're sitting here on March 5th or 6th and the consensus is Klingberg's been bad, he's a disaster, he can't play, I think then you have to have an honest conversation about trying to go and get the best right-handed defenseman you possibly can and dealing with the consequences later. You know, David Savard of the Canadiens is sitting out there. But If you want just a guy to sit in the press box, I think Ian Cole of the Utah Hockey Club is probably the move. A lot of NHL experience, a lot of playoff experience. If he comes in out of the press box, you're not particularly worried he's going to lose you the game or anything. I think that's someone who's worth consideration there. We're going to take one more break on today's show. When we come back, we'll talk about adding a goalie, something I've really started to come around on, coming up next. When the game tips off, NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whenever me and my friends are together, we love doing a squad ride, picking something we can all bet on together to make the game that much more exciting. Plus, the FanDuel app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook betting partner of the NBA. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out, listening, or watching today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are talking all about the potential additions the Oilers could make ahead of the NHL trade deadline. And goalie is not something you typically see a Stanley Cup caliber team go out and add, especially if we're talking about someone to be like in a tandem or outright starter. That's not a trade you're typically going to see in season. You know, a backup on occasion, I can see a world where that would be something conducive to helping your team. But starting goalie, so much of that goalie position, and we talked about this in depth on yesterday's show. No, excuse me, 2 episodes ago. So much of the goalie position is environment. It's how does the team play in front of the goalie and how much variance can that goalie tolerate? You know, the Oilers don't pay Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard a lot of money. They have one of the lowest combined cap hits of any goalie room in the entire NHL. And because of that, you have to accept some volatility in their performance. You know, it's going to be up and down. There's going to be highs. There are going to be lows. And I don't think that they're a bad tandem per se, but I do think they leave a little bit to be desired. I think it's fair if you're sitting here as an Oilers fan and you're looking up and down the lineup to say, our goalie room isn't great. It doesn't inspire a ton of confidence. You can like Stuart Skinner, the person. I certainly do. I find him very charming. I think he's a good, at best, hockey player. I don't think he's ever going to be a great goalie. I don't think he'll ever be Vezina. I think there's an outside chance he could be the 3rd goalie for Team Canada, but I think that's more of an indictment of Team Canada's goalie depth than Skinner's quality as a goaltender. I think he is firmly in that middle tier of like 12 to 17, where depending on the night, he could flirt with the top 10 and looking like, oh, Stuart Skinner, kind of like he did against the Stars last year. And then there are nights where, like the Florida game this year, where the Oilers had a lead and he entirely just didn't have it. And some of that is, you know, Panthers are a good team. They know Skinner very well from playing in the Cup final last year. They kind of found a way to target his weaknesses. And then you as a fan have to wrap yourself around the fact that 2 playoffs in a row, Skinner's had to be pulled, whether it was 2 years ago against the Kings and they had to go to Jack Campbell, who Skinner stole the job from, or this past year where they had to go to Pickard in the Canucks series. So it's fair to be worried about the goalie position. The problem, as we've talked about a lot as far as the forwards and the defense, you don't have a ton of financial flexibility. You can always move things around. You can always find ways, but that's just increasing the amount of things you have to do to make these trades happen. I personally would like the Oilers to go and add a 3rd goalie and ideally a backup, somebody in that Jonathan Quick mold. And I think Jonathan Quick is probably going to retire from professional hockey this year after spending his entire life on the West Coast as a Connecticut native, somebody who grew up in the footprint of the greater New York area. I don't think Quick would be willing to relocate in season to go to Edmonton for 3 months. And some of me thinks you could maybe convince him, hey man, you get one more chance at a cup and then you come back to Connecticut retired. We'll give you some job in the organization. You get us a 5th round pick. We'd be happy. I don't think Jonathan Quick's going to do that. I don't think I think he's got his 3 rings. Yes, yes, technically you got to count the one he got in Vegas, even though that he was not instrumental in making that happen. But that's the mold of goalie I would want to be adding to the Oilers room. Somebody who has playoff experience, somebody who's perfectly comfortable being a backup. Because if we talk about Vejmelka from the Coyotes, from the Utah Hockey Club, or we talk about John Gibson for the Ducks, those guys are going to want a more even allocation of starts. And I think at that point, you are, I don't want to say poisoning the relationship you have with Stuart Skinner going forward, but you're definitely putting it in a different light. You are definitely telling him, we don't know about the long-term vision here. And look, I don't think the Oilers need to go out of their way to accommodate Stuart Skinner, but he has given them reasonable enough hockey for what they are paying him, that they don't want to go and upset the rest of the dressing room, because that does matter to some degree, that the guys on the team feel good about the decisions that are being made. Now, if you want to talk about this purely from a hockey perspective, going to Vejmelka and going to more of a 60-40 split as opposed to a 66-30 or 70-30 like the Oilers have right now with Pickard and Skinner, I think you could talk me into that. Now, I know Elliot Friedman isn't always the best source of information. I know he very, very diligently covers his own butt as far as reporting things and saying, I heard from somebody who heard from somebody, and really removing accountability from his reporting. But if he says, don't count the Oilers out as far as John Gibson, I can see it. John Gibson has long wanted out of Anaheim. That is a team that is in a plateaued transition where they tried to go from his wave of guys to whatever that next group was going to be, and it stagnated. The Ducks are very much stuck in a talent acquisition phase. I really like their young core guys. Even the Mason McTavishes and Troy Terrys, who haven't really popped off crazy, I will always defend what Trevor Zegras can be if given the opportunity. They gave up on Jamie Drysdale and have yet to really do anything with Cutter Gauthier of note, who I like, but again, hasn't really done a whole lot. But Gibson coming in here and expecting to be the starter and having a month to get used to playing behind this team, it would be very reminiscent of what the Blues did last decade when they were in good position playoff-wise. They traded for Ryan Miller mid-season, who was on the Sabres, who was on a pretty bad Sabres team at the time, and it just didn't work. And in the nature of a playoff series where so much can go wrong and so in such short order, last year in the playoffs, Connor Hellebuyck won the Vezina Trophy in the regular season, and he was the worst goalie in the playoffs. Hockey is fickle. Dropping someone in a completely new environment and telling them, yeah, we'll figure it out. Oh, and the expectation is to win a Stanley Cup. And the backup that we have now, he has fragile confidence. So us going from him as the full-time starter to him being your backup, that nuked his confidence. So if you struggle, we have to go to a guy who doesn't feel great about his game. So good luck. It's a really tall order. It's a really tall proposition. Pricing a goalie acquisition is tricky. We don't really see these types of trades all that often in season. I think if you were to talk me into, for playoff purposes, go get a goalie with playoff experience. Go get an old guy just for Skinner to lean on, just to have insurance in case he gets hurt. If you really are saying this is our last cheap year of Bouchard, Draisaitl, and McDavid, we need to go as hard as we can, we need a better goalie, and you go get John Gibson, I can accept that. I wouldn't agree with that. I wouldn't think that was the right course of action, but I can accept that. I understand wanting to do that, raise your ceiling as a team. But these are the decisions the Oilers have to make. They have a lot of extenuating circumstances as far as Evander Kane, when he can return, what that means for the cap. They have to manage the personalities where they've had guys who are on the team all year, and you don't want to piss them off by pulling them from the lineup for guys who are going to be here for a month and a half before going on to greener pastures on July 1st and getting a payday. So there's a lot to consider. We'll probably have one more of these trade big boards before March 7th. We'll have a special episode on March 7th about the deadline itself, but probably one more of these trade boards before we call it a day on this type of content. That'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. After today's episode, we should be back to day of recordings or day before recordings, where they will be a bit more topical. I was away the last several days, so appreciate you bearing with me. Didn't want to leave you guys in a content desert, but did need to record ahead of time. I will talk to you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.